I married my high school sweetheart, Mark, when I was just 18. We had been together since we were 14, and at the time it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Our families approved, our friends were supportive, and I felt like we had something truly special. We were inseparable back then, completely and utterly wrapped up in the fairy tale of first love. Mark was an athlete, the golden boy of our town. He played football, basketball, and even dabbled in tennis. If there was a sport, he was good at it. Everyone expected him to go pro, and so did I. He worked hard, trained for hours, and his future seemed so bright that it was practically blinding. But life doesn't always go according to plan. During a game when he was 21, Mark suffered a devastating injury. It wasn't the kind of injury you could shake off or bounce back from in a few months. It was the career-ending kind, the kind that left doctors shaking their heads and whispering words like irreparable damage and long-term consequences. Mark didn't take it well. In fact, he refused to accept it. Everyone around him knew his professional athletic career was over, but he clung to the idea of a comeback like it was a life raft in the middle of a storm. He started seeing a physiotherapist, a rehabilitator, and told anyone who would listen that he was working on a full recovery. He spent hours in the gym, followed strict diets, and went to endless doctor's appointments. Meanwhile, life went on for me. I wasn't a 14-year-old with stars in my eyes anymore. I was building a business. I worked long hours, often late into the night, trying to turn my small online boutique into something that could support us both. And for a while, that worked. I told myself it was temporary, that Mark just needed time to get back on his feet. But as the months stretched into years, things started to shift. At first, I admired Mark's dedication to his recovery. I thought it showed his strength, his unwillingness to give up on his dreams. But over time, I began to notice that while I was running around trying to grow my business, Mark wasn't really doing anything. He'd go to his rehab sessions, come home exhausted, and then spend the rest of the day watching sports on TV. He wasn't even training anymore, just recovering. I started to feel like I was carrying the weight of our entire life. I was paying the bills, managing the household, and trying to keep everything afloat. And Mark, he seemed perfectly content to let me. He didn't look for work, didn't offer to help with the business. Instead, he kept insisting that he still needed more time to heal. I don't know when it hit me, but at some point, I realized that Mark had become something I never expected, an alphone. You know the type. Someone who lives off their partner, contributing little to nothing while expecting the world. And yet he'd say things like, "I'm working on getting better for us," or "This recovery is harder than I thought." And I, ever the dutiful wife, believed him. Or at least, I wanted to believe him. But the truth was he wasn't recovering. He was coasting. He was taking advantage of my hard work while pretending that his rehab sessions were as grueling as my 12-hour workdays. Months passed, and Mark still hadn't gone back to work. I started to resent it. I'd come home late, dragging myself through the door after back-to-back meetings, only to find him lounging on the couch, drinking protein shakes like he was still in training. When I'd ask him how his rehab session went, he'd always say the same thing. "It's going well. I'm making progress." But nothing seemed to change. He never seemed to improve or get any closer to being the man he once was. And then there was the strange part. He was recovered, completely healthy, at least according to his medical records. So why was he still going to see the rehabilitator 3 times a week? Why did he always insist that he needed more tests, more checkups, more everything? Something wasn't adding up. The unease gnawed at me, but I pushed it aside. I told myself I was being paranoid, that Mark was just doing everything he could to get back to normal. But one afternoon, my doubts got the better of me. I decided to leave work early and surprise him by picking him up from one of his rehab sessions. Maybe it was a gesture of support. Maybe I just wanted to see for myself what was really going on. I'll never forget that moment. I arrived at the rehab center a little before Mark's session was supposed to end. I didn't tell him I was coming. I wanted it to be a surprise, or at least. That's what I told myself. In reality, I was starting to feel like I needed answers, and I didn't want to give him the chance to hide anything. As I walked down the hall towards the rehab room, I felt my heart pounding in my chest. I had no idea what I was about to walk into, but part of me hoped that everything would be perfectly fine, that I'd find him working hard on his recovery, and I'd feel guilty for ever doubting him. But that's not what I found. I opened the door to the rehab room quietly, peeking in before stepping inside. And there, right in front of me, was Mark, shirtless, sitting on the exam table, and a young, half-naked nurse practically draped over him. Her hands were on his chest, and they were laughing about something, completely unaware that I was watching. I felt the air leave my lungs. For a moment, I was frozen, my brain unable to process what I was seeing. Was this what Mark had been doing during his rehab sessions? Was this the recovery he had dedicated himself to? I stormed into the room, my shock giving way to anger. The nurse, wide-eyed, jumped away from Mark as if she'd been caught doing something illegal, which, in my mind, she practically had. Mark's face turned pale the moment he saw me. "Amelia," he started, but I cut him off. "Don't," I said, my voice trembling with fury. "Don't you dare." The nurse, who was clearly much younger than Mark, scrambled to collect her clothes, mumbling something about just a misunderstanding before darting out of the room. I didn't care about her. All of my rage was focused on Mark. "What the hell is going on?" I demanded, my voice louder than I intended. "Is this your rehabilitation?" Mark tried to stammer out some excuse, but it was pathetic. Something about how he didn't want to hurt me, and that this wasn't what it looked like. But I wasn't stupid. I knew exactly what I had walked in on. All the times he told me he needed more rehab, more tests, it had been a lie. He hadn't been recovering from anything. He had been fooling around with this young nurse while I was out working my butt off to keep us afloat. The betrayal hit me like a ton of bricks. This was the man I had loved since I was 14. The man I had believed in, supported, and sacrificed for. And this was how he repaid me? By cheating on me while I was out making a living for both of us. I didn't wait for him to explain himself. I turned on my heel and walked out, leaving him scrambling to follow me. For the first few days after I left, Mark blew up my phone with calls and texts. He sent me long messages about how sorry he was, how he had made a mistake, and how it wasn't what it looked like. But I didn't need an explanation. I knew exactly what it was. Betrayal! It didn't take long for me to start packing up my things. I couldn't stay in that apartment with him. Every corner of it was a reminder of what we had once been, what I had thought we had. But now it was just a lie. Mark, true to form, didn't fight me too hard. He made a few half-hearted attempts to apologize, but I could tell he wasn't really invested. And why would he be? He had already checked out of our marriage long ago, probably around the time he started his affair with that nurse. To add insult to injury, I found out later that he had been using my money that I had earned from my business, to pay for their little rendezvous. The rehab center fees? Yeah. Turns out they weren't for his recovery. They were for their dates. The sheer audacity of it all made my blood boil. But instead of wallowing in my anger, I decided to do something about it. I was going to rebuild my life without Mark. I left Mark. I moved into a new apartment, took a short break from work to gather myself, and leaned on my friends and family for support. At first, I wasn't sure how I'd survive the heartbreak, the betrayal, and the shame. But as the weeks went by, I found strength in the most unexpected places. Mark, surprisingly, didn't put up much of a fight when it came to the divorce. In fact, I think he was almost relieved. He got to go off and live whatever fantasy he had created with his nurse, and I got to move on with my life. Just as I was settling into my new life, feeling empowered and ready to take on the world, fate decided to throw me a curveball. It was a few months after the divorce, and I was attending a business conference for women entrepreneurs. I had thrown myself into my work, and my boutique was thriving. I felt more confident, more powerful than I ever had before. As I stood in line for coffee during one of the breaks, a man approached me. He was tall, sharply dressed, with a confident smile that made him stand out in the sea of tired conference-goers. "Excuse me," he said, flashing a charming grin. "You look like you know what you're doing. Mind if I pick your brain about a business idea?" I smiled politely, thinking it was just another networking pitch. But there was something different about him. His name was Daniel, and he wasn't just another guy at the conference. He was a venture capitalist looking to invest in women-led businesses. We spent the rest of the conference talking, laughing, and sharing ideas. It was refreshing to connect with someone who saw me for who I was, a driven, hard-working woman who had built something out of nothing. Daniel didn't know about my past with Mark, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could start fresh. Weeks passed, and Daniel and I kept in touch. We had lunch meetings that quickly turned into something more. Before I knew it, we were dating, and for the first time in years, I was genuinely happy. But life has a funny way of keeping you on your toes. Just as Daniel and I were getting serious, I started to feel different. At first, I chalked it up to stress, or maybe just excitement of being in a new relationship. But when I missed my period and started feeling nauseous, I knew something was up. I was pregnant. I sat in my bathroom, staring at the 2 pink lines on the pregnancy test. My mind raced as I tried to process what was happening. Pregnant! Now, just when things were finally starting to go right in my life. I had left the wreckage of my marriage behind, picked up the pieces of my career, and met someone wonderful. Daniel. The last thing I had expected was to find myself back in the whirlpool of diapers, sleepless nights, and the endless chaos of motherhood. And yet here I was, clutching a pregnancy test and feeling like I'd just been thrown into the deep end. I debated how to tell Daniel. We'd only been dating for a few months, and things were still new, fresh, exciting. Would this news change everything? Would he freak out? Or worse, would he leave? I spent the rest of the day in a daze, my thoughts consumed by the impending news and what it meant for my future. When Daniel called that evening to ask if I wanted to go out for dinner, I agreed, knowing that I had to tell him sooner rather than later. We met at a quiet restaurant downtown. As soon as I saw him, his warm smile and easy charm immediately put me at ease. He greeted me with a kiss on the cheek and asked about my day. We made small talk, but the words felt hollow, like I was holding back a tidal wave of emotions. Eventually, Daniel sensed my unease. "You okay?" he asked, leaning forward with concern. "You seem a little off tonight." I took a deep breath. There was no use delaying the inevitable. "Daniel, there's something I need to tell you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm pregnant." For a moment, he just blinked, as if he wasn't sure he'd heard me correctly. But then slowly a smile spread across his face. "You're pregnant?" "Yes," I said, bracing myself for whatever reaction might come next. To my utter surprise, Daniel's grin grew wider. "That's amazing!" "Wait, what?" I stammered, not quite believing what I was hearing. "You're okay with this? I mean, we didn't exactly plan for this." "I know," he said, reaching across the table to take my hand, "but I've never been one to stick to a plan. And honestly, I'm excited. I've wanted kids eventually, and now, I guess eventually just came sooner than we thought." His words sent a wave of relief washing over me. I had been so worried about his reaction that I hadn't even considered the possibility that he might actually be happy. But here he was, embracing the news with the same calm, confident attitude that made me fall for him in the first place. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" I asked, still in disbelief. Daniel laughed. "No one's ever ready for something like this, but I know we'll figure it out. Together." From that point on, things between Daniel and me only grew stronger. We started making plans, finding a bigger place, preparing for the baby, and figuring out how to juggle our careers with the impending arrival of a little one. It wasn't easy, but there was something thrilling about it all. Daniel was by my side every step of the way. He attended doctor's appointments with me, helped me assemble the nursery, and even got into the habit of reading every parenting book he could get his hands on. It was sweet, though I had to laugh at how seriously he took it. "Did you know that babies can recognize their parents' voices in the womb?" he'd ask, sounding like an overexcited college student cramming for an exam. Did you know that babies sleep, like, 16 hours a day? That's more than half the day. It was cute, really. He was more prepared than I was, and I was the one who had been through it before with my first child. Bella, now 6, was both excited and confused about having a little brother or sister on the way. She was thrilled to be a big sister. But she kept asking questions like, does the baby get its own room, or will it sleep in my castle? Her room was decorated like a full-on princess castle, of course. Things were going great, better than great, actually. We were excited for the baby. My business was doing well, and Daniel and I were falling more in love with each passing day. It was almost as though the universe had finally decided to cut me a break. After everything with Mark, I was finally moving forward. But then, out of nowhere, life threw me yet another curveball. One afternoon, as I was heading out of the grocery store, I nearly bumped into someone I hadn't seen in years. I looked up and, to my utter shock, there stood Mark, my ex-husband. He looked the same, but different, older, maybe a bit rougher around the edges. His hair was shorter, and he had a 5 o'clock shadow, but it was unmistakably him. "Amelia," he said, his voice full of surprise. "I didn't expect to run into you here." Neither did I. The last time I saw Mark, I was packing up my things and leaving him after catching him with his nurse. I'd been so focused on rebuilding my life that I hadn't thought much about where he'd gone or what he was up to now. "What are you doing here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Mark shrugged, looking sheepish. "I moved back to town a few months ago. Needed a fresh start. I didn't want to reach out to you. Figured you wouldn't want to hear from me after everything." He wasn't wrong about that. I nodded, unsure of what else to say. It felt surreal, standing there in the middle of the grocery store parking lot, face to face with a man who had turned my world upside down. "How have you been?" he asked, his tone cautious, as if he knew he was treading on thin ice. "Good," I said, trying to keep the conversation short. "Really good? Actually, I'm with someone new now, and we're expecting a baby." Mark blinked, clearly taken aback. "Wow, I didn't know you. Well, congratulations." There was an awkward silence before I finally said, "I need to go. But take care, Mark." As I walked away, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions. Seeing Mark again after all this time reminded me of the pain he had caused, but it also reminded me of how far I had come since then. 9 months felt both like an eternity and like it had flown by in the blink of an eye. Before I knew it, we were in the delivery room, waiting for the arrival of our son. Daniel was by my side, holding my hand and nervously pacing around the room as if he was the one giving birth. "Are you okay? Do you need water? Should I call the nurse again?" Daniel asked for the 10th time, his voice full of nervous energy. "I'm fine, Daniel," I said, half amused and half exhausted. "You need to relax." But how could he relax? He was about to become a father for the first time. I could practically see the excitement and terror warring on his face. And then, after hours of labor, our son was born. The moment they placed him in my arms, all the worry, all the stress of the past months melted away. He was perfect, tiny, with a full head of dark hair and a set of lungs that could probably shatter glass. We named him Jacob, and from the moment he let out his first cry, my heart was completely and utterly his. Daniel stood beside me, his eyes wide with awe. "We made him," he whispered, as though he couldn't quite believe it. "Yeah, we did," I replied, smiling through my tears. Life with a newborn is chaotic. There's no other way to describe it. Between the sleepless nights, endless feedings, and the constant need to change diapers, it felt like I was living in a whirlwind of exhaustion and love. But there was joy in it, too, watching Daniel hold Jacob, seeing Bella take on her new role as the big sister with pride, and feeling the warmth of our growing family made it all worth it. Bella took her role very seriously. She'd sit next to Jacob's crib, reading him stories from her favorite princess books, as if her brother could somehow absorb all the magic of fairy tales. One day, he's going to be a knight, she told me proudly, and I'm going to teach him everything. Daniel, on the other hand, was adjusting to fatherhood in his own way. He became the master of the baby swaddle, though the first few attempts were more burrito than baby. He stayed up with me during the night feedings, and even though he couldn't do much to help, just having him there made everything easier. There were moments of laughter, too, like the time Daniel accidentally put Jacob's diaper on backward, and didn't realize until after a very messy incident that we won't speak of ever again, or the time Bella tried to help by feeding Jacob a bottle of apple juice, only to find out babies definitely don't drink juice. Despite the chaos, life had never felt fuller. I had a family, a real family, and I was surrounded by love in a way that I had never experienced before. Daniel was everything I had ever wanted in a partner, and Jacob was the sweetest addition to our lives. There were still challenges ahead, I knew that. Parenting isn't easy, and there would be sleepless nights and tough decisions to come. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of what the future held. I had survived betrayal, heartache, and loss, and I had come out on the other side stronger, wiser, and more capable than I ever thought possible. As I sat in our living room one evening, cradling Jacob while Bella played with her toys and Daniel flipped through a parenting book, I felt a deep sense of contentment wash over me. We were a family, a perfectly imperfect family, and that was more than enough for me.